Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. I'm Samia Aziz, celebrating the power of literature and the voices of authors and changemakers from the global majority. Join me as we explore the stories that inspire, connect, and transform our world. Let's uncover the stories that truly matter together. It's my pleasure to welcome today Professor Sunny Singh, a writer, academic, and cultural thinker whose work explores the intersections of identity, inclusion, and the stories we tell or suppress about power, violence, and survival. Sunny was born in India, and over the years, her life has spanned continents and languages. She studied in Spain and in India. Before firmly anchoring herself in the literary world, she also worked as a journalist and cultural manager in Mexico, Chile, and South Africa. Over time, she's written novels, creative nonfiction, essays, and short stories. She also serves as Professor of Creative Writing and Inclusion in the Arts at London Metropolitan University. Beyond her writing, Sunny has been a powerful force for literary equity and promoting diversity. In 2017, she launched the Jhalak Prize, a prize for writers of colour in the UK and Ireland, and continues to engage deeply with questions of decolonisation, representation, and the literary ecosystem. In recognition of her work, she was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Her new short story collection, Refuge Stories of War and Love, is a striking, ambitious volume that brings into conversation the most urgent and often silenced narratives of conflict, displacement, and resilience. Over its dozen or so stories, the collection moves across continents and histories, touching on war zones, refugee lives, gendered violence, memory, and the possibility of tenderness even amid devastation. What sets Refuge apart is how it refuses easy binaries. Perpetrators sometimes carry scars of suffering. Survivors negotiate moral compromise and loss. The stories do not dwell on revenge, but insist on empathy, nuance, and the endurance of human dignity. Still, the collection does not shy away from brutality, sexual violence, war crimes, colonial legacies, and the way these violences embed themselves in bodies, histories, homes, and memory. And yet, the final gesture of many of these stories is not surrender. They gesture towards renewal, connection, and the redemptive potential in telling the stories we fear. I'm so glad she's my guest today. Professor Sunny Singh, welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Yes, I'm fine. Bright sunshine outside for a change in September, so that can be good.
Yeah, it can be good. So we're here today to talk about your latest book, which is called Refuge: Stories of War and Love, which is a short story collection that delves into the many different facets of war and love. Love within times of war, love, I would say, also as a refuge from war. And it's a really beautiful, tender collection of very, very short stories. Some of them are as short as just a simple scene, almost like a conversation between a husband and a wife, or some of them span a little bit more, but we're talking really, really quick glimpses into people's lives, but quick glimpses that tell us so much. You explore so many layers and so many different facets of life and love and war. And I know you've written across genres. You're an
Yeah,
academic,
yeah,
you've written fiction, you've done some memoir writing also. So tell me a little bit about what drew you to short stories and what this particular form means to you and why you decided to explore this topic through short stories.
yeah. So, thank you for that question. This is my seventh book, and so I have done three novels before this, and I've published three nonfiction books, of which one of them is an academic study. So I cut across, as you rightly said. Um, I think the first part of a short story I, it's a challenge. Short story as a form requires a kind of discipline and a kind of a spareness that is really hard to do. And um, I, as a writer, I like to challenge and kind of go, okay, what, why would I try something? Um, but short stories for me also go back to when I was growing up. And I grew up in India, partly, and then also Pakistan as a young teenager, and then various other places. But short stories have long been a form, well, long. I think the first Hindi short story dates back to the First World War. But, there is Manto. There are so many incredible 20th century writers, Premchand, obviously, um, who wrote in the short story form. And not just in Hindi and Urdu or in Hindustani, but across the many languages. And so as a child growing up, I was exposed to quite a lot of those because I went to school. We had this magazine in the 70s that would be delivered to us, and it was in Hindi, and it had these amazing short stories from various languages that had been translated into Hindi, if not written in Hindi. So in many ways, it's a form that I have grown up with and I love. I started writing this collection almost 25 years ago because
Wow.
it took a long time because
Mm.
I wanted to write something, a collection that talked about how we think about war.
Mm.
And in the West, in Britain, US, there is the tradition of the short story, but there is also the tradition of the war story. And the war stories are always about generally a Western, mostly for most part white soldier who goes off somewhere terrible to fight the war, right? And he's supposed to be the hero. He's the righteous one. He's going off to far, far, far lands, um, to fight a war that seems to start when he arrives, whether it's Vietnam or it's, Egypt or, take your pick,
Mm.
India. And then it ends when he leaves.
Mm.
Um, or he dies gloriously, and then it's a sort of heroic death. And I remember back in the 90s, about the same time, there was this wonderful, when I was thinking about it, there was a quote by a writer by the name of Southeast Asian writer, Timothy Moe, who said, wars end when I'm paraphrasing very badly, wars start when the white man arrives, wars end
Mm.
when the white man leaves. And we know that shot in the movies, right? When he looks out the window, and it's almost 99% of the time it's a man, but often now women, looks out the window and the land is burning and the people are kind of forgotten, right?
Mm.
And of course, I'm from a former colony, so I grew up seeing that the wars didn't end.
Of course.
They needed, and I wanted to write in a way right back to that idea of this just war that happens on
Mm.
lands of people who have nothing to do with it, who have no choice. It's been inflicted on them,
Mm.
and that continues. So it took me a while to plan it. I wrote one story, and this was about 2002, 1, 2, and very quickly realized I didn't have the capacity to write it,
Mm.
the collection. So I did not have the literary skill, the technical craft. I didn't have the psychological capacity. I did not have the knowledge. And I did not have the ethical capability to address these stories properly.
Mm.
So I said, okay, I will put this aside. And I worked on other things. So I wrote 4 different books. I did my PhD, and alongside, I kept developing these stories,
Yeah.
because and I only wrote a story when I felt I was ready to tackle it.
Mm.
And then in each case, I had to really think it through, not just research wise, but ethically, politically, morally, what it means to write something. And in each case, I would then reach out to people whose,
Mm.
in many ways, whose stories or whose peoples these stories are about. So to make sure, it's a kind of due diligence. I hate the word sensitivity or authenticity. Really, it's like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
It's due diligence. It's about making sure the facts are right, but also making sure I'm very clear, because growing up in, in the in a former colony, and many former colonies, in fact, you realize how stories are used to
Mm.
colonize us, to oppress us, to genocide us. And the one thing I've always kept very clear in my head, I don't want my writing to do harm.
Mm.
I can't
Absolutely. Mm.
often, well, hopefully not often, I can't always prevent that,
Mm.
but I can try on my part to not do harm with
Yeah,
my work.
absolutely. Yeah. That's amazing. 25 years in the making. That's phenomenal. So when do you think you wrote sort of like the bulk of the stories, or did it happen very gradually over time?
I think I wrote it in spurts. So I did the first story and I said, I can't do this again.
Mhm.
I'm going to put it away. And then I wrote a novel. I then started working on a PhD and I was doing a lot of research anyway. So a lot of that came through.
Hmm.
Um, and I think, but the bulk of them were written, and well, let me rephrase that. The bulk of them were written around the pandemic.
Okay.
But also, I went back and redid all of the stories because I think, there is a kind of moral arc that when you keep working at yourself, and there's a political, ideological commitment, but you keep working at yourself, you realize, that's not great. So I reworked a lot of the story, well, pretty much all every story, because I just felt that some of them weren't, I had, when I'd written them, I hadn't been careful enough because I didn't know how to be careful enough. So I had the opportunity to go back and redo them, which is a joy and a privilege because most people don't
Absolutely.
have that.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully that's left you with less regret than had you not been able to do that.
No, no, no regrets. I think I feel comfortable, and I feel that I have honored the people who trusted me with their stories with the
Yeah.
collection. So I'm okay with that.
Absolutely brilliant. And so you describe this sort of narrative that comes across when for so long people have been talking about war. And I think it's important to remember that is from a very Western colonizer viewpoint. And I think for me, like the main lens through which so many war stories have been historically told is through power and dominance. It's all
Yes,
about
yes,
who's there to save the day, who's in control, who's going to take power over this land, who's going to take power over the situation, and essentially who is controlling the narrative.
yeah,
And so what your collection does actually is doesn't talk so much about the power and dominance of leaders or armies or
yeah.
those that perceive themselves to be in control.
Oh,
Your narrative is around human connection and love
oh.
and unity and family and community. What do you think that really does in shifting the narrative around war?
Well, so I am bored
Hmm.
by stories of the powerful.
Yeah.
I'll be very honest. I find them the same. They're the same stories: how to become a hero, how to beat somebody else, how to defeat them, and then you get the good side. So the same things are done, and that's the hero. And if someone else does it to you, then they're the bad guy. So that's the villain. And I find that really boring.
Mm,
I think for me, what's always fascinated me is how human beings endure
mm,
and resist. And over time, I've realized that our capacity for love is possibly the most extraordinary capacity we have. It's the form of resistance that transcends
Mm.
any brutality we humans can inflict on each other.
Yeah.
So these stories, these are stories about not just love in this romantic way,
Mm.
but it's also about um, transgenerationally, parents and children. They're about making connections. They're about recognizing each other's humanities in places where it's very hard,
Mm.
um, and almost impossible. These are, colonial violence, and that is really what the last 500 years of war have been on the planet
Mm.
in different ways, directly or indirectly. These are all forms of colonial violence and intended to create and maintain colonial dominance. When you step away from that and you look, I want to know, how do we endure? How do we
Mm.
continue to resist? How do we not lose hope? How do we not lose faith that there will be a day when we can be free, when we can be free from violence, when we can be free from injustice, where we can be free from the horrors that we have to experience and witness.
Mm.
And the heart of that comes down to the human capacity to love,
Mm.
to refuse the brutalization, to refuse the dehumanization by saying, no, we care for each other.
Yeah.
We care for each other regardless, and
Mm.
regardless of what is known to us. And I
Mm.
think to me, that's been always the fascinating part,
Mm.
right? There is one story that and as you said, what can it achieve? I'm going to try to find it for you, because I haven't actually read very much, or thought about it. But when I wrote this particular passage, I think I was very clear what I wanted to
Mm.
say, and I think this is towards the end. And it's a woman who has survived the Bosnian genocide, and the story kind of traces her art, but it's also about how she thinks about what has happened. And for me, this is more at the heart of it. This is the collection, because she thinks about it. She's thinking about her daughter. She says, the living tell the stories, the living keep the memories, the living raise the children, and it is the living who choose which stories, memories, and names are told to the children.
Mm.
And I think for me, this is it. So the colonizers have, they still control vast parts of the press and the
Mm.
movies and the music and everything. And yet, the colonized for 500 years have over and over and over found ways to tell the stories
Mm.
to us. So all of us got those stories from our grandparents, from, I got it from in books as well, but grandparents, parents, that makes sure. And that's love. So for me, telling these stories is about saying, we don't have to name the powerful. I refuse to give them
Mm.
that grace, that
Yeah.
honor. I want to say, yeah, I think if we focus on the stories of us, our
Mm.
resistance, our resilience, our survival, our love, we can begin to change how we think of the world we want to build and to live in.
Mm. Yeah. And I mean, just while reading the book, but thinking more widely as well, you know, it made me think so much about this weird sort of narrative and reporting style of war, which is often that everything else stops. and it just focused on the violence and the battle. But actually, children are still growing up and needing an education, and people are still falling in love, and couples are still arguing about things around the house. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's
Yeah,
still everyday things are still
yeah,
happening, and that means that love is still existing and thriving.
yeah.
Maybe it's changing, and the intensity of it is changing, and the parameters of it are changing because of everything that's going on, but it's still there, and I agree with you and would argue that it is the basis of everything. When you are an oppressed people, your your sort of determination to tell your story is more
Mm,
fierce.
yeah.
And that I agree is I think that is a form of love. Love for yourself, love for your identity, love for your people, love for your family.
And love for the land, love for all those. I remember part of the research that I was doing was about when in the First World War, South Asian soldiers were brought over. They were essentially cannon fodder
Mm,
for Britain and France, and France and various other places that used colonial troops in the two world wars. Um, but it was also the first time, from South Asia at least, that vast number of soldiers saw, for lack of a better word, white people
mm,
living their own lives without the colonial barriers and foundations which were inflicted, ensured, which were implemented to kind of ensure this sort of superiority or the vision of superiority. I mean, it's basically a version of apartheid, right?
yeah.
To ensure that the colonized population and the colonizers don't interact except in very, very sort of regulated ways. And I've always been struck by how they wrote about those relationships, how they wrote about the land, how they wrote, and there we have troves of letters that were sent home,
Mm,
even despite the censors, and the kind of blanking out. Um, and the ways in which they remembered their home while they were kind of,
mm,
for all intents and purposes, forced to go and kill people somewhere else,
mm,
um, with very little understanding of why they were being sent to do this, except getting on with life. So I think there are these strange places, but I think that the love for the land, the community, the kind of, even while colonial troops have this very strange space where they're complicit in the colonization and yet they are also colonized. So I wanted that kind of thinking of how you look at land. The colonial process has been about control of our lands,
mm,
of pillaging our lands for 500
mm,
years, of destroying it while extracting whatever can be extracted.
mm,
um, so a lot of this is kind of bound up, and to write about that land is a form of love. To write
mm,
about rivers, to write about mountains. I can see a picture from any angle, and I can tell you if those are my mountains.
mm,
So not just Himalayas as in like the big range. I can tell you the exact part of the Himalayas that are mine.
yeah.
So
Amazing.
that is something
Mm,
I can do. I can see part of the river, and I say that's the river.
mm,
That's my river. I know it's my river.
mm,
And I think those are very different ways of loving,
yeah.
but they are also a form of resistance.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I I wonder if you what you think about the connection between love and rage, and how not only does that impact those that are being oppressed, and I mean I think we're all oppressed in different ways, but like if you are living through a genocide or living through an occupation, but how that also fuels um calls for justice and activism, that connection between love and rage. And I feel like if you love something so deeply, or you feel a connection, and whether that connection is maybe not even to the land or to the people, but the ideas of justice and wrongdoing and survival, and just the abhorrent nature of genocide, how the connection between love and rage, and how what that can do as a form of resistance.
Well, let's think about not just love and rage, but love and sorrow.
Mm,
So much, if you switch the lens, and again, I was very fortunate. I've been extremely fortunate to grow up between India and Pakistan, in my first X number of years, so early up to my early teens, meant that I read an enormous amount of literature from both
mm,
countries. And then but also India in the 70s, we had a lot of Soviet literature. We had a lot of things that were non-Western
mm,
writing. And what that meant, and Soviet literature is a very complex place, but it is very much, especially early, 20th century, it's when it's post initial revolution, that's sort of, 20s into about 40s period, especially children's literature, is very much kind of revolution based,
mm.
right? It's about justice and it's about overthrowing an unjust regime often. Um, and building community and all of that, those ideas, which landed very well with, a country that's just in the process of decolonizing politically.
Yeah.
And I think those things are not separate. I think if you look at stories, literature, culture, however you want to call it, from places that have been colonized, and in most parts of the world in different ways continue to be colonized,
Mm,
we start with love for our communities, our people, our families, our land, all of those. But we also start from a sense of loss and
mm,
therefore a sense of grief. And therefore, we start with an additional side of rage.
mm,
Why? I mean, if someone you loved was being mistreated,
mm.
you would be angry,
Yes.
right?
Mm,
But I'm also very clear that one of the ways that the empire works is it demonizes and criminalizes our anger.
yes.
And I think so that rage is constantly demonized.
Mm,
I was seeing this slightly mad framing from somebody on social media, and I think it's an Israeli, and um, they said something along the lines of the Palestinians hope that, you know uh, if they continue the violence, we will give up, and we continue thinking that, believing that, if we continue our violence, they will stop resisting us. And I just saw this
gosh.
morning, and I just went, that, have you actually, can you actually see what you're saying? And
Yeah.
also, can you see the last 500 years of history?
Mm,
No people across the world, whether it's Australia, and we're talking in this case settler colonies, Australia, New Zealand, Latin America, North America. I mean, take your North and South Americas, take all of the extractivist colonies. When have we stopped resisting because your violence got so much?
exactly.
You do not come to us and take over our land. Do not destroy our communities, our families, our peoples, and just assume that we're going to roll over and die.
Mm,
So I think there is a real sense, there's a gap,
mm,
and a huge gap. And I always think that we must consume the colonizers' narratives very critically. but
Mm.
we must learn to find the colonized stories,
Mm.
because that's what the empire doesn't like. And
Mm.
I for my sins, I also do a lot of work with diversity in publishing, which is a grim word. But at the heart of it is, they don't want to tell our stories. They don't want people to read our stories. So this idea of, oh, we can let in a token XYZ, but that's it. But never, very rarely on the front of the bookshops, and not going to get the big budgets that various other very imperial, racist, bigoted writers
Yeah.
do get. Why? That is not an accident. That's by design. That's why your kids in this country will not read, and we're not even talking race and empire. They're not going to read many working class narratives,
Yeah.
right?
It's very true. Yeah.
They're not going to read. Why are we still talking about middle class, variations of Enid Blyton,
Mm.
or another private school fantasy with magic thrown in,
Mm.
where they all grow up and they marry each other after
Mhm.
having their little flings with the foreigners, and then have kids who are going to do it again and again and again.
Mm.
And you realize these are the narratives that get pushed globally, not
Mm.
just here, pushed.
Mm.
Those are the colonial narratives, those are the colonizing narratives, because God
Mm.
forbid, if your kids start reading the other side, the the, the the narratives of resistance, then you've got trouble on your hands.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Sunny, I'm really quite intrigued by the fact that you spent some years of your childhood in India and some years in Pakistan.
Yeah.
Um, I wonder, and obviously I know that you were very young, you were a teenager, but I wonder
I was
what
11 to about, yeah, 11 to 16. My
okay,
family lived in
so
Pakistan.
yeah,
So,
you're a
and I
teenager.
was there for about 3.5 years, and then went back to do my GCSEs in India,
Mm.
because we were supposed to move and we weren't sure what was happening. So,
Yeah, okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I just wonder what insight that may have given you because so my family's from Pakistan and I know now a lot more about my family history because now I know more about partition than when I was growing up. But the one thing I still don't know much about is the experience in India. And and there's many
yeah,
complications about the relationship between India and Pakistan, but it is they are they are the result of
yeah,
a, a colonizer that decided to brutally and violently divide a land in
yeah,
its most simplest form, right?
yeah,
And what you've created is two enemies,
yeah,
which is
deliberately by design.
absolutely, absolutely
Yeah,
divide and conquer, right? Yes.
yeah,
Pre-partition and post-partition, and so we now have these two countries that seem to despise each other politically and culturally also because you have to create an enemy, right? In order for this to succeed as a
yeah,
campaign, there has to be this enemy. We can't If you had unity between India and Pakistan, the colonial narrative and mission would have completely failed and they would have created a country more powerful than themselves.
yeah,
But I
exactly.
wonder what having grown up in both sides of the border, if you like, whether that gave you any insight into things that has influenced the work that you've now done.
Well, so it was a very strange process, because my father worked for the Indian government. So
Mm,
we were posted in Islamabad. And this was the first years of, early years of Zia's big Islamization, Arabization of Urdu, all of that.
mm,
The Soviet Afghan War was on.
mm,
So, it was very strange to go from India, where you're living in sort of small towns and border towns, and suddenly end up in going, wait, there's all this stuff happening around us, and very visibly.
mm,
And I went for most part to a school, in Rawalpindi cantonment.
mm,
So other than maybe like 10 of us, everyone in that school was not only Pakistani, but all their parents were
Mm.
in the Pakistani military.
Oh.
So it's a
Mm.
very strange way of thinking about my experience. It's not a
Mm.
normal experience for most
No.
people.
Yeah.
And but it was very useful because um, I was bullied because, of course, the narratives of enemies of how we, that those exist.
Yeah.
But I was also protected
Hmm.
by the same group, if you want to call it. So if they were kids on the playground who didn't like the fact that I was Indian and Hindu,
Mm.
they were also kids on that same playground that said, no, that's not okay.
Mm.
So I had very, very close friends. And one of my very early friends in Pakistan at school was actually somebody whose father was in the Pakistani army, was
Mm.
very senior, and had actually been held as a prisoner of war in India in
Oh.
71.
Mm.
And we were about as close as tween girls can get,
Mm.
right? And we were just like locked in. And I think if, these are pre-social media times, so one day I keep hoping that I'll find her again. There was another person whose father was General Zia's physician.
Mm.
So, I think for me, I know my teachers. I mean, there were some really amazing teachers whose names I still know. I've gone back. One of them, somebody who basically read my early stories, very dotty as they were, as 11-year-olds will write. She was my English teacher, and she then became principal after we left. I just realized that she's passed away a couple of years ago. But she had been the principal of that school. And she read my drafts and my stories in my notebook, and she would correct them and she would add comments to them. And this was not because she was trying to, this was not something she was teaching. She was just mentoring and nurturing somebody who wanted to tell stories.
Mm.
So for me, it's very hard it took me a long time to figure out how to manage these two realities. The fact that we have two countries that go to war on a regular basis and kill each other, and our politicians and lots of our establishment and elite hate each other, or at least say they hate each other. And then there's the regular people
Mm.
who are very complex as ever, right? But at the heart of it is exactly what you said. How can we talk about independence or decolonization when we have accepted the borders and national structures that were given to us by the colonizer?
Yeah.
How do so we can say, okay, we accepted it, but why?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. 1947, August 14th, 15th, you accepted it. You could technically have reversed it
Mm.
3 months down the line. The saddest part of it is that same autumn in 1947 is when UN votes, and India and Pakistan are both members. There's only about 30 something countries that are members of at that point, because the rest of the world is divided into empires. But India and Pakistan are all both there. That is the vote on the partition of Palestine to create Israel.
Mm.
11 countries vote against it. They include India and Pakistan,
Mm.
who vote against Iran and Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan. So Cyprus and Greece, Turkey. So pay attention to the ones who know that this is bad.
Yeah.
And yet, because of multiple issues, including a kind of, on all sides, an elite that kind of knows it's going to benefit from this,
Yeah.
they choose to stay within the confines, the structures and borders and identities that have been imposed on us. by the colonizer. And to me, that is very revealing of how much work that we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. It's very, it's very somber. It's very, it's devastating to think about it, especially when you put it as easily as like, okay, well, if they had accepted it on the 14th, 15th of August, they could have reversed it a few months later. But we know that it is complex, and although the partition decree did happen seemingly overnight, this was a very targeted approach by the UK government
And
at
the
the
US,
time,
and
and the
that
US.
was the great game.
Yeah.
This was not sort of UK alone. This was very much about handing over, if not political and geographical control, then at
Mm.
least the influence,
Yeah.
and keeping it very much within the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
that's
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah.
So, in some ways, after 1945, and even though the process has been put in place well before, because Soviet Union and China and the changes that they can see are happening already in the first half of the 20th century, it's very much about making sure that their influence continues and there's a transfer of power to the new Western superpower,
Yeah.
as in the US. And that's really what we're looking at. It's somber, but I don't think, and devastating, you're right, but I always think it's the kind of thinking that says, stiffen up our spines, there's more work to be done.
Yes. Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
this is not when we get discouraged. This is not when we get disheartened. This is when we say we will not accept and we will
Mm.
work to change it, however long it takes.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. So the collection of your short stories is called Refuge. Um, and just the concept of refuge is so layered. It means many different things. And
Yeah.
I guess on the surface, we think of it as being safety and belonging, maybe sanctuary. But sometimes refuge is temporary and fragile. Sometimes it is more long lasting. But if we think about refuge in terms of like refuge shelters, often that is very much a transitionary thing. It's about
Yeah.
getting somebody out of a
Yeah.
state of danger and putting them in somewhere safe in order to then move them on. But we do know in war across the world, what is supposed to have been temporary refuge places of refuge have ended up being people's residence for years and generations and decades in many cases.
Yeah.
um, but what does refuge mean to you? And yeah, I guess how did your understanding of refuge, or what you wanted to explore when it comes to refuge, shape the stories that you've written?
Well, I think refuge. First of all, I think I used that title for a particular story, which is about a refugee family, a family that is fleeing war and is separated. It's a father, mother, and a child, and they're separated. And I set it deliberately in Syria, and
Mm,
in the Syrian civil war and the refugee crisis that erupted um, just a few years ago.
yeah.
And and somewhere in my head was also the story of the Christ child,
Mm,
right? The idea that this whole, for lack of a better word, a holy war that is being waged by the West
mm,
on everyone who is different, um, ignores the ways in which they replicate the story of Christ child over and over and over ad infinitum through 500 years by creating the conditions of that horror, the fleeing, the needing to find a safe place for children over and over again. So somewhere at the back of my head, there was that idea. But I also wanted to think about what it means to find safety and but what it also means to find or learn to re-love after being traumatized.
Yeah.
And I think that is also a kind of refuge, emotionally, psychologically.
Mm.
I grew up also, so my early years, I grew up in the mountains in India, and the largest community around us were the Tibetan refugees who had fled from the Chinese invasion. And Tibetan is one of the languages, as often kids do, I learned and forgot and lost. So, but it's very much there as this concept of this forced expulsion that happens to so many of us. In fact, I would say most of the world's population that is alive today, has had some direct or indirect experience
Mm.
of having to flee um, within the last 5 to 6 generations
Mm.
and having to find a safe place.
Yeah.
Again, I think we need to tell more of those stories
Yeah.
because we try, and I see this even or even with a lot of post-colonial writers, writers from the colonies, especially the ones that have gained some form of independence, political independence or political liberation. There's a kind of triumphalism going, oh, okay,
Mm.
now it's done. It's not done, because that that history continues.
Mm.
And I'm not saying people can go back. And I think this is where the dangers come in, and the far right capitalizes. It's not about going back to some pristine past where people lived in their ancestral land and had never moved.
Mm.
But it's about thinking how we build a world that takes into account
Mm.
these journeys, these the search for constant safety that
Mm.
continues to elude most of the world population.
Yeah.
And we can't have a just world, we can't have a free world,
Mm.
unless we can't have a peaceful world, unless we think about the idea of
Mm.
how we center not just the people who are being displaced constantly with wars in our lifetimes, but who have this long process and a
Mm.
long history of it. And that's 500 years of displacement, of
Mm.
mass displacement. Um, and we need to come to grips with not just that it happened, but how do we confront it, and how do we build from it together,
Mm.
as opposed to saying, well, the refugees are not our problem. I have been in this country for blah blah blah. I mean,
Yeah.
that rhetoric, and it is constantly seized on by the far right because they benefit from it,
Absolutely.
right?
Mm. Mm.
Rather than saying, well, I mean, let's talk about Britain. Britain,
Yeah.
every single street in this country is paid for in blood of the people who were colonized, enslaved, and genocided.
Yes.
In talking about United India in 1930s, most of the taxes collected in India were shipped,
Mm.
was sent to Britain,
Mm.
right? Less, so 1 rupee out of 100, every 100 collected in taxes from United India, so all of South Asia, was actually used for any kind of work in the region itself.
Mm.
Let's think about that, right? So when they
Mm.
say, "Oh, no, no, you were built by money that came on blood and
Yes.
rivers of blood. Those are the real rivers of blood."
Mm. Absolutely.
So, and that needs to be confronted. It cannot be confronted by going, oh, we're going to stop the boats.
Yeah.
Stop the boats of people who are fleeing wars that are being paid for, armed, inflicted by the same country.
Yes, absolutely.
So, we can't
Completely.
move. We need to break out of that kind
Yeah.
of mode of thinking, and
Yeah,
telling different
definitely.
stories hopefully will gets us thinking.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot as well, and also while reading your book about the sort of about silence and erasure, and historically and even today, obviously some of it is most of it, most of the silence is intentional. It's driven by an agenda
Mhm.
to tell a certain narrative. We know, just because we've been talking
Yeah.
about the partition of India, we know that so many documents and things were literally drowned and burned, and evidence was gotten rid of physically. But there's another side to sort of silence, which is around trauma. And I think about this a lot because I guess this is also part of my lived experience. But in one of the very early stories in this collection, we meet I guess like a husband and wife who have been separated, and they come together and they're talking about the different scars on their bodies, and it's a hauntingly beautiful story. And although they are saying this is from this and this is from this, there's also so much unspoken grief and pain and trauma, and so much that
Yeah.
they are not telling each other about what happened. Some of which they are implying, and some of which they are saying very bluntly just to get it out. But they're not really talking about it. And I think that is actually the first story in the collection, and it's so like it's just hauntingly beautiful because it shows a glimpse into how difficult it can become for people to talk about what they've been going through. And I think that a lot about the previous generations, so the generations of our parents and our grandparents, which is why so many of us in my generation and our generation have scrambled to understand, put the pieces together about what happened and who we are and why our parents are the way they are and why our upbringing has been the way it has been. And filling in those gaps has been integral, I think, to our own understanding and self acceptance and self love that comes with that. But there is so much about silence, forced, but also the one that come naturally from the inability to speak of one's trauma. And I wonder what your engagement with that has been like while
Oh.
writing this book, but also just generally in your work.
Well, I think part of the reason this book took so long
Mm,
to write was because I had to learn. So when I started back in, 25 years ago, I was in my 30s. And I didn't realize that there was anything like trauma work.
mm,
And trauma work, not just in terms of psychologically and you're sort of working on yourself and your own loss and grief and
mm,
trauma and transgenerationally inherited loss and grief and trauma. But the fact that when you start researching, when you start reading other people's work, when you start watching, when you decide to witness
mm,
either history or what is unfolding in your reality,
mm,
you then are traumatized. And there are responsible, ethical ways that you must develop
yes.
to manage that for yourself.
Mm,
Um, if only so you can continue to do the work
mm,
for however long it takes us. So I think that was for me the most important lesson. There was a point when I actually felt that I couldn't, and I would take these long breaks between research and writing and thinking about this because I would just not, I would be, I would just be shattered. Um, and then slowly I realized there is a kind of, you have to put your own safeguards and you have to kind of create the ways that you're going to engage with things, how you work with that. So I think that's a really important thing I would suggest that we all take on board. But I think the other thing, other part that I learned was transgenerational silences,
Mm.
right? And you've mentioned our parents' generation. So in different ways, our parents' generation, mine, for example, are literally the midnight children. My dad was born just before independence, my mom just after. Um, but I remember growing up with my grandmother,
Mm.
and she would talk about things that, but she would be very, she wouldn't talk about the sort of, she would hint at certain things, and there would be other things, other ideas. But then there was also, there were these strange rituals. So there's this ritual about, there's this one, the first roti that's made, which is smaller, and
Mm.
it's apparently linked to the fact that, it's not eaten, or there's something, it was strange, or it's half cooked and put aside, like on the tawa,
Mm.
because that's, she would, and I kept going, what's going on here, right?
Mm.
And that was actually, it took me a long time to keep digging till I realized that it goes back to 1857 and the revolt then, the Ghadar, because after that it's a marking of those who could not eat in time, or those who were constantly fleeing. So there's these kind of
Mm.
weird things, and it's and then they were prosecuted, the rebels, if they,
Mm.
as the, you know um the British Empire called them, were prosecuted and persecuted constantly for decades after. So you there was that whatever could be said had to be said very quietly.
Mm.
But all parts of the empire have these small rituals if
Mm.
you start going back. So I think for me, what was really interesting was to learn how the silences are maintained,
Mm.
but also broken.
Yeah.
And in some ways, you have to kind of learn the code, learn the language,
Mm.
and then you suddenly get a key into a whole world. And I think for me that the conversation between that couple is very much about, very much rooted in the sense of, there are these little clues,
Yeah.
and each word they say, or each phrase they say, there's a whole world,
Yes.
and that they're talking about, that, is not spoken out loud.
Mm.
And I don't think we need to say out loud
Mm.
what everything. I think the readers are very capable of figuring out what
Yeah.
else is going on.
Yeah.
And also, these are, in so many ways, these are experiences that happen to so many of our fellow humans, that the specifics are not that important.
Yeah.
To say it's a prison in Syria as opposed to a prison in Israel or in the US, at the end, the conversation that is held in that moment, in that story, it's immaterial where the
Yes.
prison is.
Yes. Exactly. It's very true. It's been really wonderful talking to you, Sunny. And just as we wrap up, what do you really hope for anybody that picks up your book?
I would say, please read it. Um, some of it, I think, is probably quite uncomfortable.
Mm.
Um, but I think discomfort is a sign of that something happens to us, and we should probably embrace it.
Yes.
Think about the people we are told not to think about,
Yeah.
because I think every story here is very much about people we don't see on our news, and we don't see in our most of our movies and
Yeah.
TVs and so on, and most of our stories. So if it makes the reader think about, thinking, oh, I'm going to go find out a little bit more about the people I don't know anything about,
Mm.
that would be it.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Sunny, for your time today. It's been absolutely wonderful. I hope you loved listening to this episode and found things that will stay with you. I'd love to hear from you, so please do reach out on social media and don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review, as it can really help.